Okay, hi everybody. So I'm going to try and go through 8 arguments in this video. It ain't going to be quick, folks. I've got the notes, right? I know it isn't going to be quick. But 8 arguments which I think are some of the most specious and ill-founded and yet recurring arguments in the whole debate and conversation over trans women in sport, and how we try and find a path forward with regard to that. This is a subject that I have not talked about for pretty much a year now. And what I don't want to do is to try and reinvent my own particular wheel. I've made videos before outlining what I think we could do to try and tackle these issues, how we could go forward, what the arguments are, what the problems are, etc., etc. I don't want to redo that. But what I do want to do is to try and tackle what I see as some of the worst arguments that are made, effectively propose that, give you what I think are the alternatives, and then you can decide for yourself if I'm right with regard to that. Some of these I've mentioned in videos in the past, so it's putting them together. Some of them I haven't. I have 2 doughty lieutenants, unwitting lieutenants, admittedly, with regard to that. A guy called Brenton Lengel and Sargon of Akkad, who had a debate recently on the Modern Day Debate channel on this subject: should trans women be allowed to compete in women's sport? That was the title of the debate. I have to tell you, I've watched the debate, the full 2 hours and 20 minutes. It went wildly off topic for some of that. It is not the best debate that I've ever seen, but it is a marvelous well for me to visit in terms of finding a sort of high density of these arguments. It's like these little rare earth metals you find at the bottom of the abyssal plain of the ocean in the highest concentrations anywhere on the planet. That's what this debate was for these kinds of arguments. So I'm going to be playing you clips from that. Now, just let me say in advance, of these 8 arguments, Sargon of Akkad is making 2 of them. Brenton, I should say, is making 6 of them. You could draw from that the conclusion that in some ways I think Sargon of Akkad did a better job, or that I side more with Sargon of Akkad. If that's the conclusion you want to draw, then that's fine. But I have to tell you that it's also at least as much a function of the fact that Sargon of Akkad spent a greater proportion of his time seemingly going wildly off topic and hammering in the same 2 or 3 nails all the way through. Brenton seemed much better prepared, in some ways much more read up on this particular subject, and so he had a greater arsenal of different arguments to bring to the table, albeit most of them of the kind of arguments that have the people, the sort of the upper echelons of the interested parties within sport, the kind of arguments that make them groan, but nevertheless those are the arguments that were made. So I'm going to go through those arguments now. I'm going to kick off with an argument that Sargon made, and I have to say, let me warn you, this is probably the driest argument of them all, but due to the fact of what it entails, it will be referenced with some of the later ones, so that I need to bring this one out first. If you find it too dry, just move on through. I will put a full sort of running order of the arguments in the footnotes, so if you find one particularly dry, or you see one that looks particularly tasty and you're interested in, you can just go straight to that argument. Okay, Sargon of Akkad.
Because really, this does all come down to definitions. And fundamentally, I just don't agree that trans women are women, because I think the definition of woman is adult human female. And I don't think that a person who is born male is a female.
I 100% don't want to get too caught up in the debate on whether or not...
Fair enough, that's off topic.
Well, I'm afraid it's going to have to come down to that, because that's the problem that we're having here, right? The phrases male and female, the gender roles of man and woman, were not created by scientists. They're just observed by scientists, because these are the innate biological properties of human beings. Mankind has known about these since the dawn of time. They are the prerequisites to us forming families and having children and reproducing for the next generations.
Okay, so a couple of clips of Sargon there, beating on that particular nail. And I could have played you any one of a couple of dozen clips from that. And it was one of the most frustrating arguments within this debate for me, and it's something you hear of a lot. And it's kind of indicative of something that you see with a lot of online debates, which is people hammering on a particular line of argumentation that is so far adrift from where the parties are within that particular field that you're effectively just driving yourself into a little corner of irrelevance. As it stands, Sargon of Akkad may as well just face and talk to the wall, if that is the line he's going to go down. All the sort of major stakeholders in these things, World Athletics, the IOC, World Rugby, the Court of Arbitration for Sport, they have all considered these things now in some depth. And they are working from a position where they are separating the ideas of gender and sex, and they are using the term woman to refer to gender and not to biological sex. So any point that you are going to try and make that relies upon the definition of woman being biological human female is, regardless of the merits of that argument, effectively just sidelining yourself. It's a waste of time. It is a waste of breath. You need to get up to speed with the argument that is actually taking place. However, there is another side to this, another way in which this word is co-opted, abused and misused. And to try and highlight that, let me play you a clip first from Brenton on part of this same subject.
So to begin, first off, all definitions are arbitrary because language is symbolic. So there is no such thing as a fixed definition. You can change a definition for a word. Literally, language only exists and words only exist because they have utility. So there is no such thing as a fixed definition. Second of all, there is no such thing as a fixed definition for woman or man or anything else.
Okay, so the reason that I play you that is that Brenton is bang on there. That wasn't the point that he was trying to make, but he's absolutely right there. And there are people out there who do this with the word woman. They take this understanding now of woman as pertaining to gender and female as pertaining to biological sex and these things being distinct, but then they take those definitions and anachronistically look back in the past when women's sport was in the foundational stage and we started calling it women's sport and we didn't differentiate between female and women and assume, well, it must be to do with gender then. This sport must be segregated on gender grounds because it's called women's sport. Of course, we know that this kind of anachronistic definitional game is wrong. Christians accuse atheists of it. Atheists accuse Christians of it when it comes to text, when it comes to the Bible, a book that was written 2,000 years ago, translated centuries ago, and all these different people had different understandings of the words, and you can make some serious errors if you don't take account that what you understand by a word might be different from what they understood by a word. If I tell you I am gay, I think you'd understand what I meant. If you read a book from 1850 and it says I am gay, and you assume that means that somebody's homosexual, right? You're taking your modern definition and assuming they mean the same. There are people out there who adopt the principle that it's called women's sport. Women refers to gender, trans women are women, ergo it's all to do with gender, and you play in the sport that corresponds with your gender. Otherwise, why is it called women's sport? And that doesn't take account that 50 years ago, 70 years ago, when the seedlings of women's sport were starting, that they didn't make the same differentiation between the two things. Okay, so that's the other side of that particular coin. However, you will be pleased to know that the sporting bodies are apparently not quite that dumb when it comes to parsing these things. So what I want to do is to read out for you something that will furnish you with the information so you know what the state of play is with regard to this and with regard to how sporting bodies are looking at it and where they are coming from. So what I want to read for you, I want to read from the full arbitral award delivered by the Court of Arbitration for Sport in the arbitration between Caster Semenya and Athletics South Africa and the International Association of Athletics Federations, which is now called World Athletics, by the way. And I want to read from page 146, paragraphs 557, 558, 559 and 560, the first part of that paragraph. This will take a couple of minutes to read out, folks, right? And you need to listen to this and think carefully about this, because this is very, very interesting. It's very informative, but you need to get your head around it. You also need to get your head around the three things that they're talking about. They're going to be talking about gender, they're going to be talking about biological sex, and they are also going to be talking about legal sex, which effectively, if you change your gender identity or if you're falsely given the wrong sex identifier at birth, right? Somebody thinks that you're male and you're actually female, thinks you're female and you're actually male, then your biological sex and your legal sex may be out of line. Just bear that in mind when you read this and when you try and think about what they're trying to say here. Okay, so this is what it says. The panel begins its consideration of this question by observing that once it is recognised that it is legitimate to have separate categories of male and female competition, it inevitably follows that it is necessary to devise an objective, fair and effective means of determining which individuals may and which may not participate in those categories. The panel understands this point to be common ground. The panel accepts the IAAF's submission that reference to a person's legal sex alone may not always constitute a fair and effective means of making that determination. This is because, as explained above, the reason for the separation between male and female categories in competitive athletics is ultimately founded on biology rather than legal status. The purpose of having separate categories is to protect a class of individuals who lack certain insuperable performance advantages from having to compete against individuals who possess those insuperable advantages. In this regard, the fact that a person is recognised in law as a woman and identifies as a woman does not necessarily mean that they lack those insuperable performance advantages associated with certain biological traits that predominate in individuals who are generally, but not always, regarded in law as males and self-identify as males. It is human biology, not legal status or gender identity, that ultimately determines which individuals possess the physical traits which give rise to that insuperable advantage and which do not. On true analysis, therefore, the purpose of the male-female divide in competitive athletics is not to protect athletes with a female legal sex from having to compete against athletes with a male legal sex, nor is it to protect athletes with a female gender identity from having to compete against athletes with a male gender identity. Rather, it is to protect individuals whose bodies have developed in a certain way following puberty from having to compete against individuals who, by virtue of their bodies having developed in a different way following puberty, possess certain physical traits that create such a significant performance advantage that fair competition between the two groups is not possible. In most cases, the former group comprises individuals with a female legal sex and a female gender identity, while the latter group comprises individuals with a male legal sex and male gender identity. However, this is not true of all cases. Natural human biology does not map perfectly onto legal status and gender identity. The imperfect alignment between nature law and identity is what gives rise to the conundrum at the heart of this case. And then finally, once it is recognised that the reason for organising competitive athletics into separate male and female categories rests on the need to protect one group of individuals against having to compete against individuals who possess certain insuperable performance advantages derived from biology rather than legal status, it follows that it may be legitimate to regulate the right to participate in the female category by reference to those biological factors rather than legal status alone. Okay, so sorry, that's pretty long-winded and dry. I apologise for that. But hopefully you can see, if you were listening to that, why Sargon's argument is just so far adrift from where the thinking is in sport, but it's also incredibly irrelevant and incredibly unnecessary. You can make all the arguments that you would want to make in the framework that sport is using without having to keep hammering on this nail and insisting that, well, my definition of woman is biological human female. That is irrelevant to the discussion in sport, and you can make all the arguments without that. Okay, on to the next argument that I want to deal with.
So larger doesn't always matter, like depending upon the sport.
It depends on what you're doing.
Yeah. So take, for instance, volleyball. On average, volleyball players have gotten taller and taller in each team as, history and as we've recorded such a thing is going on. On top of that, trans women tend to be taller than cis women volleyball players. Now, here's the other thing.
Because men are bigger than women.
And guess what? Out of all of the Olympic wins in women's volleyball, the tallest team has only won once since we started tracking it. The tallest team almost never wins. So again, this is a very simplistic way of looking at things.
Okay, so this is an argument that I've heard loads of times, and it is a really, really wonky argument that's used to try and suggest that somehow height is less important than it actually is. The problem is, if you accept the logic for this, then absolutely nothing within sport becomes important, because what happens is anything that seems to be really important, critical for that sport selects for. So everybody within that sport has it, and because everybody within that sport has it, it means that everything else then becomes relatively more important than that characteristic within that particular population, and lo and behold, it doesn't seem as important anymore. Now, Brenton talked about volleyball players here. I don't know that much about volleyball, so I went and had a look at the stats, and I got some stats for some male volleyball players, and by Christ, they are a tall bunch. The data that I got, and I'll throw it up on screen, this table was for the 2012 Olympics, the top 4 teams. Now, the positions opposites and middle blockers appeared to be the tallest of all the positions. And I can tell you that the average height there is 6'9". That's even taller than basketball players in the NBA as an average. The shortest in those positions was 6'6", and the tallest was over 7'2". Now, I found an online calculator that seemed a pretty good one. It had obviously a lot of data put in. You could use average heights for nearly every country in the world. Very, very impressive. And you put a height in, put the sex, male or female in, and it tells you roughly within that population how common it is for people to be that tall or taller. And I can tell you that 6'6", which was the shortest guy in any of those teams in those two positions, only 1 in about 700 people are that tall. Right. The average height, 6'9". It's about 1 in 30,000 people are that tall. Men are that tall. The tallest, over 7'2", it reckoned that it's about 1 in 100 million. Right, so in terms of making a selection for height, you've just made the most incredible selection for height you could imagine. Right, the average height there of that team, only about 1 in 30,000 of the population are that tall. So you've already made an incredible selection for height. It's no wonder that once you've made that selection for height, that other things start to become more important. To put this into some context, let me tell you about basketball in the United States. Pablo Torre, a few years ago for Sports Illustrated, ran the calculations and he estimated that there's about 70 American men between 20 and 40 who are 7 feet tall. That was his estimate. And on the grounds of that, what he suggested, and also looking at how many men there are between 6'6" and 6'8", that if you're between those latter heights, you have a 0.07% chance of playing in the NBA. Whereas if you're 7 foot or over, drum roll everybody, you have a 17% chance of playing in the NBA, right? A 17% chance, about 1 in 6 guys, or people, because it's only guys who are that tall in the United States will get to play in the NBA. Now, the upshot of that is this, is that if you then crunch them numbers, I put them into that calculator there, and what the calculator suggested is that roughly what you're talking about here is that you've got about 500 people, right, who are 6'6" to 6'8" for every individual who is 7 foot plus. Now you think what that means in terms of those other factors, right? you know that all these other skills, the sort of ball handling, dribbling skills, the ability to shoot accurately, it doesn't matter what sport you're talking about, they're not even, right? Some people have more of them than others. And if you have a population of 500 individuals, you'll find some who are way better than others. If 1 in 6 7-footers in the United States are playing in the NBA, what that tells you is that you can actually be pretty low down the pecking order in terms of those other ball sport skills, and your sheer height still allows you to succeed in the NBA. Whereas the 6'6" to 6'8"ers, you're getting the cream of the crop. You're getting the tiny fraction who are excellent at handling the ball and all those ball related skills right there. So is it any wonder that when you compare those 6'6", those 6'6" to 6'8"ers to those 7-foot-plussers, you'll find that many of those 6'6" and 6'8"ers are better than the 7-footers because there's such a bigger pool of them to pick from that you have much more skilled individuals in every other aspect. I put it to Brenton and anybody else, if there was as many 7-footers as there are 6'6"ers to 6'8"ers, then perhaps other than in the guard positions, which I understand the height is not quite as critical, you would not be seeing any 6'6"ers to 6'8"ers because there would be 7-foot-plussers who are just as skilled as they are, but just taller. Okay, so and the interesting thing is, earlier on in his discussion, Brenton mentioned VO2 and how important VO2 max is in terms of endurance events and endurance running. Okay, and how much important that is if you want to be elite in those particular things. But the same thing would hold true there. If you look at a group of elite distance runners, they all have incredibly high VO2 max scores. But in terms of that selected group, you will find that it's not always the individual with the highest VO2 that wins. But it would be a terrible misstep on the grounds of that to assume, well, VO2 isn't really that important then. To put this in another way, let me read you something that Ross Tucker published on his excellent sports science blog. I really recommend Ross Tucker, really recommend his blog to you. He is one of the best people that I know of in the world in terms of these subjects and picking them apart. This is his kind of stock in trade, and he is respected throughout the sports world on that. This is what he had to say with regard to this. Or take VO2 max, which nobody should refute is crucial for endurance sports success. I've seen studies where the relationship between 10-kilometre or marathon running time and VO2 max is as high as R equals 0.9, a very good predictor. But if we took the elite men and women from the last decade of marathon runners, it would be impossible for you to tell me who was the fastest based on VO2 max. You may as well throw darts at a list of names to rank them. That is, VO2 max is a poor predictor of performance within the group of elite runners. Does this make VO2 max irrelevant? Of course not. Why? This is the classic range problem. When you are looking at the predictive value of something, call it X, then its predictive power disappears when you look at a homogeneous group who all have X. Basically, you filter it out by selecting for it. In this case, other factors take over and X starts to look less important. In fact, X was the crucial factor that got you into the conversation. It's like you have to have the ticket to get into the VIP lounge at the club, but once you're in there, then your designer clothes and your dance moves make the difference to your social standing because everybody in there already has the ticket. The ticket, to labour the point, is testosterone, or rather, to put my spin on it, the ticket is androgenization, testosterone's effects. And when you try to find the effect of testosterone on performance, if you look at it in a group of similarly androgenized athletes, in brackets men or women for example, then you will obviously find little to no effect because the way you've asked the question has already filtered it out. Okay, so this is the important thing. Ross mentions it there, is that effectively, ironically, the argument that Brenton was working on here argues against his point. His point is that he's fine with trans women competing in female sport as long as they've taken cross-sex hormone therapy, as long as they have reduced their testosterone sufficiently and for a sufficient period of time. But if you apply his reasoning, well, it isn't always the athlete with the highest level of testosterone that wins the event. So it's the same as height. You can't make the argument when you want and then just get rid of it when you don't want. If you can rule height out of the equation, and the height advantage is on the grounds that it isn't always the highest athlete that wins in events like basketball and volleyball, then you can rule testosterone out of the equation because it isn't always the athlete with the highest level of testosterone that wins. Again, it's the same business. We've already selected for these things within pools of male and female athletes when we differentiate, just as we've already selected for height when we're looking at elite volleyball and elite basketball.
But just in case you're still not convinced that the playing field is level, I'm going to take this one step further. Because from a philosophy of sports perspective, none of this actually matters. We are missing the forest for the trees. The fact is that a truly level playing field is impossible. And if sports were just about bringing your own inborn advantages to bear in a perfectly controlled environment, literally no one would care about sports. The reason sports are so compelling is they bring together so many aspects of human existence and heighten them to a degree where we as the audience watch and wonder, how? How did they do that? How can the human body even perform such a task? It defies imagination. No one cares that Michael Phelps's body literally does not produce as much lactic acid as everyone else, that his muscles simply do not get tired like a mere mortal. They don't complain that his relatively short legs give him an extra kick, or his comparatively long, double-jointed arms reach further and pull more water than any of us could. No one wants to put him in a league of his own because of his larger hands or the fact that his torso is more hydrodynamic than any other person's. He's not a freak because of his inescapable inborn advantages that put him a head and shoulders above any and all competition. No, we watch Michael Phelps do what he was put on this earth to do, and we are captivated. We honor him, and he honors us and his competitors and the sport. He does
about a minute left.
And his singular uniqueness, and that is exactly the attitude we need to take towards trans folk, and especially trans women in sports.
Okay, so I know this isn't Brenton's original argument, because this argument I've heard maybe a dozen times or more now, and it's nearly always Michael Phelps that's used to furnish this example. It's a really dodgy argument from the outset because it applies to any segregation within sport. It doesn't just apply to trans women and whether trans women should be allowed to compete with cis women with some residual advantage. It applies to any of these segregations we have in the first place. If you accept the logic of it, then we should dismantle men's and women's sport entirely. We should dismantle age banding. We should dismantle weight categories because, hey, Michael Phelps's extra long arms are unfair, so why does it matter? Let's throw the baby out with the bathwater. Michael Phelps, who probably do quite well in the bathwater, to be honest, with the swimming capacity, Michael Phelps is actually quite an odd character to pick because Michael Phelps competes in what is effectively the ultimate open category, right? He isn't kept separate from anybody. He's in an age open category, a weight open category. He's in the men's category, which effectively is an open category because there's no female swimmers that are going to beat him. So anything goes as long as you're not taking performance enhancing drugs in his category. So he's a strange one to pick. Before I give you my little thoughts, my sort of philosophical take on this, I want to read you again from Ross Tucker and what he had to say. He tweeted in a response to this, "Have seen this so, and 5 or 6 interview raised it too. I get the idea, but the argument is flawed. We don't compete in categories for people who produce more lactate or who have short arms or torsos, and because we don't protect those people, the comparison is irrelevant." And I'll kind of elaborate on that in a minute, but I want to read you also what Ross Tucker had to say in one of his blogs, which is sort of elaborates on that a little bit more. Another problematic argument in this area of concept is the notion that having a high T value is a natural advantage and thus should be ignored. Because after all, we don't regulate things like height in basketball or foot size or arm length in swimming. I've seen academics make this argument, and I don't agree with it. I want to talk briefly about why this is problematic and ultimately possibly damaging to the sport if these people were to win their case. First, we don't compete in categories of short people in basketball or people with small feet and short arms in swimming. This is important because our decision not to protect the people with these disadvantages means that we don't need to concern ourselves with things like feet size or arm length. It's irrelevant. If we decided to police foot size in swimmers, maybe it would become relevant. But, and here's the thing, we have decided to protect the competitive integrity of women's sport. We do this because we understand that in two athletes who are equal in every respect except for biological sex, the effects of testosterone in the biological male create such a large disadvantage for the athlete without those effects, biological female, that they would vanish from sport altogether. Thus, having drawn a line, we must defend the line. Okay, let me try and give you my take to build on that, give you a sort of philosophical response to what Brenton says was his philosophical sport argument there. I think it is based upon a misunderstanding that some things in sport are unfair, right? And that there's some things that are unfair that we're taking account of and some that we're not. I dispute that right from the start. I contend to you that there is no natural ability in sport which is unfair. Being male may be an advantage, but it's not unfair. Being 27 years of age in your sporting prime is not unfair. Being 220 pounds, 100 kilos, is not unfair. What is unfair is being 100 kilos and then boxing in the featherweight division, a division that is explicitly there to protect lighter boxers from having to box against people like you who are 100 kilograms, 220 pounds. What is unfair is being 27 years old in your athletic prime and competing in a masters category or competing in a juniors category, age-banded categories that are explicitly designed to protect those athletes from the advantages of people like you who are in your sporting prime. What is unfair is having these insuperable advantages of male biological pubertal development and then competing in a category that is explicitly designed to ring fence and protect another category of people from those who have those insuperable advantages that you possess. So here's the rub. Nobody is saying that being male is unfair. What is unfair is being male and having those advantages unless we can mitigate them in some way, which is where I would have some common ground with Brenton, unless you can fully mitigate them and show that you've done it, competing in a category that is explicitly designed to exclude people like you who have those advantages. None of that applies to Michael Phelps's arms. His arms give him an advantage, but he isn't competing in a category of people, swimmers with short arms.
So to say it again, there is no direct or consistent research suggesting transgendered individuals have an athletic advantage at any stage of their transition. And if they did, surely we would see a near total domination of women's sports in the Olympics and similar events by trans women over the last 16 years. This has not happened, and so assumption number 2 is disproven.
Okay, so let me just say straight off the bat, I think this is one of these areas we're getting in now where you're kind of damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, if you want to talk about these issues. I've heard the criticism made that, if trans women aren't dominating sport, if they're not winning anything, what's the problem? The only reason you must be bringing it up is because you don't like trans people. It couldn't be anything to do with issues of fairness in sport. And yet if you wait until trans women have won something, then the argument is made, oh, I see, so you don't mind trans women competing as long as they're not winning anything. But as soon as they win something, then suddenly it's a problem. So you're kind of damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't. But I need to address the point that Brenton has made here. Now, he is basing it on the fact, first off, let me say, that trans women have been allowed to compete under the IOC regulations. And bear in mind what happens in sports. The International Olympic Committee isn't responsible for all the different sports codes, but most sports codes are very much informed by what the IOC says. For one reason, because if you go against the IOC, they sometimes, if you're an Olympic sport, won't let you take part in the Olympic, but also because they have the resources. And so if you're a smaller sporting organisation, then it's good to take your lead off the IOC. It's not always true with groups like World Athletics and things like that. Sometimes they're big enough, they've got the big trousers on and they make their own decisions. But the IOC changed their regulations in 2015, enacted in 2016, I think, and that was a pretty significant change. So the 2004 date is kind of an irrelevance, and let me explain why. Between 2004 and 2016, if you wanted to compete as a trans woman, you had to have had your testes removed, a gonadectomy, right? And that's pretty significant because testosterone is effectively produced by two organs, the testes and the ovaries. Right, now, in male individuals, that gives you a serum testosterone level of between about 8 and 28 nanomoles. In a woman, it gives you a level between something like 0.2 to 2.5. Very, very rarely, women with polycystic ovary syndrome will go as high as about 5, something like that. So effectively, it's about 0.2 to 5 versus 8 to 30. That's what you're talking about. Now, if you have your testes removed, what actually happens, interestingly, is as a trans woman, your testosterone level goes to the floor, right? You end up with a testosterone level lower than most women because you don't have a set of ovaries that are producing that smaller level even. So that's the situation up until 2016. From 2016, the IOC changed their regulations, so you don't have to do that anymore. All you have to do is to suppress your testosterone level down to below 10 nanomoles. Now, does 10 nanomoles? Think about the numbers that I've just given you, folks. The male range is 8 to 30. The female range is about 0.2 to about 2.5, rarely up to 5. The level that you have to get your testosterone below is still in the male range. There are men, there are hormonal biological males who are already meet that classification because they are already below the 10 level. Can you see what a huge sea change of a difference that is? And so the present regulations bear no comparison whatsoever to the regulations that we had prior to 2016, and that is an issue. And a lot of people think that's an issue, and the IOC, I think, now recognise that it's an issue. World Athletics recognise it's an issue because they've put their big boy pants on and reduced it down to 5. Joanna Harper, of course, the trans woman scientist who's involved and has done experiments in this, she recognises it's an issue, and she's one of the people who's campaigning for the IOC to reduce the level. But here's the thing, right? Brenton seems somewhat mystified as to why there shouldn't, if trans women have an advantage, why shouldn't more trans women be being successful in the Olympics and dominating sports, etc. It's interesting, given that he quotes on a couple of occasions this particular report, okay, this systematic review, you'd have thought he'd have read it. And if you'd read it, you'd probably think he'd have had a fair idea why. Because one of the major features of that report is explaining to you, the reader, why there are lower levels of participation amongst trans people in sport, because that is the case, even amongst casual sport, never mind dedicated sports people trying to reach the top, even amongst casual sports and fitness activities, trans people proportionately do a lot less sports activity than cis people, and it tries and explains the reasons why. I'm sure you can imagine some of the reasons why. Folks, gender dysphoria is a pretty serious thing, and especially in your teenage years where a lot of people, it hits them most acutely, those years where you need to be training most intensely, that makes the difference between making it as an elite sports person and not, to have these issues that are going to hamper your training, that are going to hamper your mental state. You know, I heard somebody, and I think it was Caitlyn Jenner, but I went back and I cannot find the passage, so it could have been somebody else in a similar position. When she competed, of course, back in the day in the decathlon as a man, as a male athlete, what she talked about, or whoever it was that had written this thing, had said that they actually hated the training because of the masculinizing effect that it had on their body. They already had that dysphoria, and as they were training, it was making them more muscular, it was making their body seem less feminine, and they hated the effect. Now, they obviously managed to overcome that, but imagine that for a lot of trans people, they're not going to overcome that. So they're going to feel an aversion to training, right? If you're somebody who really wants to feminize your body, then as a trans woman, you're going to have an aversion to that. Couple that with the kind of prejudice and the discrimination that you are going to face, the negative attitudes you are liable to face from your fellow athletes, the vitriol that you're competing and they regard your competition as unfair or even cheating, the fact that if you win, that rather than you getting praise for it, you're probably going to get a whole load of contempt. Right, add all these different things together and you can understand. I would propose that even if trans women maintain a significant residual advantage over biological females in terms of competition, that due to the scarcity of them to begin with, all the barriers, the fact that they don't take up physical activity in the same proportions anyway, all these different things, the gender dysphoria during those key years, all these different things means that I would still expect them not to be anywhere near dominating because there's all these factors suppressing their performance. But the fact that these factors exist doesn't mean that they don't have an unfair advantage, and you don't need to win for an advantage to be unfair. You don't need to be to dominate for an advantage to be unfair. If Chris Froome wins the Tour de France and you find out he took EPO, that was unfair. But it wasn't unfair because it made him better than everybody else. It's because it made him better than the version of Chris Froome you would have had if he hadn't been on EPO. He would be cheating to the same degree if he finished 50th. And the same principle is at play here. It's not about making you better than every biological female athlete you're competing against. It's whether those residual male advantages make you better than you would have been had you not gone through male puberty. Had you been the kind of female equivalent of the person that you are.
There are some just basic facts for this that are not very controversial as I was researching for this. The differences between men and women physically are staggering. Men have got higher lean muscle mass, they've got higher bone density, they've got narrower hips, they've got 56% greater lung volume, larger hearts, higher red blood cell counts. They've got skeletal muscle mass distribution that gives men just the structure and the distribution of the way it's all done, gives them a 40% upper body and 33% lower body strength advantage. I mean, these are really staggering differences.
Okay, so I play you that bit for flavour, but this went on and on and on, really. If I was going to be cruel, I would say this was Sargon's other argument, right? He kind of vacillated between the argument that I played earlier on, this one, and then talking about things which didn't seem to have anything to do with the subject, quite honestly. And this was kind of like an argument without a punchline. It was the same thing that Rationality Rules was criticised for in his original video, and he accepted that criticism and of course amended it down the line. And the problem with that, without applying the punchline, is that effectively it's as if you're suggesting that these things which you're talking about in biological males that have had no mitigation of their hormones or of their male pubertal advantages that have been accrued whatsoever, that you are just assuming that these same advantages hold true in trans women, despite whatever things we put in place, whatever processes we put in place, without, never mind demonstrating it, without even discussing it. Now, to be fair to Sargon, he did mention it briefly at one point, but that was like 5% of that, 95% of this. And that makes it a pretty poor argument as far as I am concerned. The problem is really that Sargon was tilting at windmills here, right? Because none of the major players are looking at things in this way. Brenton doesn't look at it in this way. He regards that a trans woman would had to have had cross-sex hormone therapy. The IOC and all the other major sporting bodies, none of them are considering allowing trans women who just are hormonally natural without having their testosterone suppressed be allowed to compete. So really this is kind of irrelevant, and it's mainly things that aren't disputed anyway. So really just a bad argument.
Well, this is proven. It does.
No, it's not.
Their
You said
VO2
there's no
levels have
direct or
been
consistent research that proves that that's not the case, and you are simply assuming that is the case.
I said there's no direct or consistent research that proves they have an advantage. They don't have an advantage. So you can't prove a negative.
No, yes, you were assuming the negative because we have.
Because that's how the burden of proof works.
Okay, so I think we've all heard this before. This is a hoary old, Hoary old argument that's being trotted out here. This burden of proof argument that somehow the burden of proof lies with us to show that trans women have an advantage rather than to show that trans women do not have an advantage. Before I get on to that, just let me make 2 points. Brenton says that you can't prove a negative. That's simply not true. There are some situations where you can't prove a negative, and philosophers will happily furnish you with examples of that. But there are plenty of situations where you can prove a negative, and I propose this is one of them. It is possible through experimentation to show advantage, and it's possible through experimentation to show that there isn't an advantage. That isn't relevant here. I will also point out that the major sporting bodies have accepted with this that they are the adults in the room, and they're not going to take a position of, well, it's this side that's got to prove it, so it's this side that's got to prove it. What they've said is, we're the adults in the room. This is an important issue regardless of where it lies, and we need to be part of the motive force behind getting to the bottom of these issues regardless of what the science ends up showing. Okay, so it isn't a burden of proof anyway. It behooves these bodies to investigate these things for the benefit of both trans athletes and cis athletes. But to show you why this is a really, really poor example that Brenton has given here, he kind of tries to elaborate this a little bit down the line with an analogy. So you can listen to his analogy, and then I'll try and explain where he's gone wrong.
So first off, we got to talk about how the burden of proof works. So
I know how the burden of proof works.
Okay, so you know, for instance, that if you say there is an invisible teapot orbiting Saturn, I don't have to prove that there's no invisible teapot orbiting Saturn. You have to prove that there is an invisible teapot orbiting Saturn. So obviously the burden of proof is on you to prove that trans women have an innate advantage.
Okay, so here's the problem with Brenton's analogy and his argument here, is that he's taking no account of starting conditions, and the starting conditions are that trans women are biological males. And we all agree, Brenton agrees, everybody agrees that biological males, hormonally normal biological males, have these advantages. And I think Brenton also agrees that simply identifying as a woman, as a biological male, does not remove those insuperable biological advantages that accrue from male pubertal development and ongoing high testosterone levels. I know that he agrees with that because he believes that cross-sex hormone therapy is required. So the question then becomes, right, does cross-sex hormone therapy do the trick that we hope that it will do? And the burden of proof has to be on the side of those claiming that it does. After all, to go back to his teapot analogy, if I can reconfigure that to the actual reality of the situation, it turns out that there is a teapot orbiting Saturn. Amazing as it may seem, there is a teapot. I don't know how it got there. Maybe we placed it there. I just don't know. It doesn't matter. The fact is that we've sent a probe out there and we've seen the teapot. Right. But I propose to you that if I was to put a woolen monkey on my head, right, that teapot would disappear, right? That would do the trick and we'd get rid of it. In fact, as luck would have it, right, it's what an amazing turn of events. I have a woolen monkey here, right? So I'm going to pull that woolen monkey on my head, right? Okay, and sit here looking ridiculous with this woolen monkey on my head. I'm proposing that this makes the teapot disappear. How ridiculous to suggest that now the burden is on you to show that my suggestion is wrong and that this isn't sufficient to make the teapot disappear. So you now have to spend another decades-long mission sending a probe out. I'm going to take that off now. Sending a probe out to Saturn to show that the teapot's still there. And of course, if you do show the teapot's still there, right, and then that probe just disappears off into the outer reaches of the solar system, I then say, well, actually, maybe if I strap a piece of cheese to my arm, as well as having the woolen monkey on my head, that will make the teapot disappear. And then again, the burden of proof's onto you, another decade-long mission, and so it goes on forever. And I can just keep coming up with these things, and each time the burden of proof is on you. Clearly, that's a ridiculous set of circumstances here. Clearly, the burden of proof needs to be on me, doesn't it, if we're talking about burden of proof? Why? Because the starting condition is we already know the teapot is there. We already know that biological males have these physiological advantages. If we didn't, then fair enough, but we do. If biological males and biological females were sporting equals, there was no advantage whatsoever, then if somebody was saying, well, I think that once a biological male identifies as a woman, they're going to have an advantage, well, yes, then the burden of proof would be on them, but that is not the case. The point is that somebody declares themselves a woman, that's fine. So what happens is you say, well, okay, we propose that if you take cross-sex hormone therapy for a period of 12 months, that will mitigate the advantages that you have. Now, admittedly, right, that is a more realistic prospect of working than my woolen monkey, but nevertheless, right, the starting conditions is a significant advantage. 10% in most endurance events, rising up to 30 to 40% in strength and power events. A significant advantage, right? Surely the burden of proof is on you to show that the suggestion that you have made does the trick, right? Does what it says on the tin, does what you propose that it's going to do. If the burden of proof is on us, then it's a never-ending game, because you can just keep adding something else, right? Okay, that didn't work, well, we'll propose something else. Now you've got to prove all over again that there's still a residual advantage. Well, that didn't work, well, now we'll do this. Now you've got to prove again. That is not a tenable situation.
It's very important to also understand, like, as far as the history of sports and even men competing against women, I think a lot of the time what we've seen is the gender divide is heavily exaggerated. For instance, there was a very famous incident with Jackie Mitchell, I believe was her name. And I might be wrong with that. But Jackie Mitchell, she was a 17-year-old girl. And she was brought on as she was a really good pitcher. And she was brought on to a team, sort of like a semi-professional team, the Washington Senators. And she was recruited, as sort of a draw for the crowds during the Great Depression. Well, she wound up pitching as a draw against both Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig in a row. And this 17-year-old girl struck them both out. Now, Babe, maybe. He gets struck out frequently. He's a big swinger. But Lou Gehrig, that's crazy. And a number of women were pushing to be allowed to play baseball. And several professional teams recruited them. And then people started complaining, and then suddenly they went and barred them. So a lot of this doesn't really have to do with protecting women so much as keeping women in their place oftentimes. And the protecting women is advanced in kind of a disingenuous way.
Okay, I have to say, this is some high-level cobblers here. There's the idea that the gap's really not that big, which I'll talk about in a minute, actually. I mean, that's a subject all to itself, and there's lots of information on there. But there's just one bit of information that I came across whilst looking at this. But the main point that I wanted to address is this argument, this sort of conspiracy theory level argument, that this is really about protecting men's sport from the encroachment of the occasional woman. rather than stopping male athletes dominating women's events, not giving them any sporting opportunities whatsoever. If that is the case, you're talking about baseball. Why is it the case then? You riddle me this, that women are allowed to play Major League Baseball. There is nothing in the rules precluding women from playing Major League Baseball, yet female baseball and softball leagues do preclude males from playing in their leagues. If what you're saying is the case, then it would be the other way around. Males would be allowed to play in those leagues, and yet there'd be a ban on females playing MLB. Right. It's just simply not the case. Now, what is interesting is I went to try and find out a little bit about this, and I found an article, something called the Hardball Times, the physical obstacle for women in baseball. And the person who wrote this article is interested whether a woman will eventually get to play Major League Baseball and what that would entail. And the smart money is that they're more likely to make it as a pitcher than as a batter. Okay, and they held some crumb of comfort, and one sort of ray of hope they had was that in their local amateur running team or events, that although the races were dominated the fastest times by males, there was always a few scattering of females amongst the top runners. However, their hopes were dashed. They went and looked at the data for the NCAA results 2012-2013 and showed them as part of this really long and interesting blog piece, which I will link. And what they found is, so that these graphs of the top 500 male performances, top 500 female performances in both the 5K and the 60 metres, and it makes crushing reading. Right, the top 5 males outperform every single female in both events. Right, it's crushing, it's overwhelming, the difference, because when you get to the top echelons of sport, a tiny difference is a big difference. A 10% difference isn't a big difference, it's such a difference that it may as well be 100% for all that it matters. Quite honestly, if you're 10% down, just go home, don't even bother. I went and found some statistics for baseball. I don't know a lot about baseball. You know a lot about more than I do about baseball by the sound of it. I know a lot about cricket and about bowling, right? And there's a lot of analogous things there. But I wanted to try and get a grip on baseball. I found a piece of research from it's called Biomechanical Comparison Between Elite Female and Male Baseball Pitchers, Journal of Applied Biomechanics 2009. And what they looked at is a various sort of kinematic study of technique, but also what speeds they could generate. And the average, well, the spread actually of ball velocities for the female pitchers was 58.8 to 63.3 miles per hour, and for the male pitchers 77.2 to 85.2 miles an hour. Now, I don't know baseball. Right, I don't know baseball. What I do know is that baseball pitchers pitch a little bit faster than cricket bowlers. Right, you've got to keep your arm straight in cricket to bowl. You bowl overarm, okay, bounce the ball in front of the batsman. The mechanics are different, and the fastest that anybody's ever bowled in cricket is just over 100 miles an hour, about 100.5 miles an hour. And I know the fastest that any woman's ever bowled in cricket is just under 80 miles an hour. Now, I've faced bowlers of 80 miles an hour. I know how you play a ball of 80 miles an hour. I'm not the greatest batsman, so I struggle, right? But it's doable. I've seen a bowling machine bowl at 91, 92 miles an hour. That's just a world away. It's just a different game. It's like, how could you move fast enough, right? In cricket, there's a greater array of shots. You don't know which side you're going to hit it, whether you're going to hit it forwards, behind, whether you're going to play with a cross bat, straight bat. There's a bewildering array of decisions to make before you play a shot. To make that decision at 90 miles an hour, I have no clue. At 100 miles an hour, you can't see the ball, I've no doubt, because you can hardly see it at 90 miles an hour. There is a world of difference between 80 miles an hour to 100 miles an hour, to such an extent I would suggest to you that at the elite level, women's cricket and men's cricket may as well be a different game. Right. And cricket is a game where you don't even have to bowl fast. the difference, the drop-off between the fastest ever bowlers and typical elite level bowlers is greater in cricket, it would seem, than it is in pitches in baseball. Why? Probably because the ball hits the ground in cricket. So as well as moving the ball in the air in cricket, you can also make the ball spin and jag off the pitch. There are a greater number of varieties so that you can get away with bowling slower and use more sort of wily-guily tactics there. It's not all about out-and-out speed. And of course we understand that the problem with out-and-out speed is if you're giving it absolutely everything, right? If you're the fastest woman pitcher that's ever pitching at 80 miles an hour, and you're a male pitcher pitching at 80 miles an hour, at sort of 95% of your capacity, you know, with golf or anything, if you try and hit it as hard as you can, throw it as far as you can, your accuracy goes to shit. Right, and so even then, they're not valid comparisons. So this suggestion, it's just laughable that the reason that we have these differentiations is because men are just so scared that a woman is going to end up playing in their sport, and so that's why we have separate men's and women's leagues, separate male and female leagues, and it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense because in sports like cricket, right, women can play for men's cricket teams. My local cricket team, Louth Cricket Club, has had a member of the England women's team playing for them for season after season, right? You can't do that the other way round. It's not allowed because male cricketers would dominate. They're too big, they're too powerful, they bowl too fast, they hit the ball harder. It's just a different game, for crying out loud. And the other reason what you say makes no sense here is because, as was shown in darts this year, at the PDC Darts World Championship, a woman got a wild card entry. They let a couple of women compete each year because to give opportunities, right, to try and increase diversity. No problem with that. And for the first time, a woman won a game. She beat a male opponent.
Finally required 36.
So we're on the edge of history. 36 left for Fallon Sherrock.
Game, shot.
And Fallon Sherrock smashes the glass ceiling and wins at the World Darts Championship. The first woman to beat a man at the World Darts Championship.
First time it's ever happened. And then in the next round, she won another game. Right? And the amount of press this generated, the amount of coverage, I had a look, and like in countries that have got no interest in darts whatsoever, they were mentioning the fact that this woman had won some darts games in the Darts World Championship over in England. People like Billie Jean King, female athletes, ex-athletes, they were tweeting, they were writing and emailing to this woman, congratulating her. It was seen as this amazing moment. Right, great prestige for darts, and darts is trying to milk the little udders of what has happened there by trying to get more women in. In fact, they've given this same woman, because then she had a chance to qualify for their tour, right, along with everybody else, and she failed. So they've given her a wild card to some more events because it's good coverage for them. They've seen what a wonderful sort of marketing thing it was. Why on earth would one of these sports not want that? If you're the first baseball team, or any team, a football team, right, in the Premier League, if you had a female player, that's worldwide coverage there. Guaranteed worldwide coverage for game after game after game. You know, it's just insane to suggest that no club would want that.
Second, being born with a male body does not automatically give a transgendered woman an unfair advantage when competing, particularly not one who has undergone hormone replacement therapy for the requisite 2 years. To quote a systemic review of the data published in the New Zealand Journal of Sports Medicine, in conclusion, there is no direct or consistent research suggesting transgendered individuals have an athletic advantage at any stage of their transition, and therefore competitive sports policies that place restrictions on transgendered people need to be considered and potentially revised.
Okay, so the problem with this, and this is the last one, I just couldn't leave this one to one side, is this wasn't a review of the data. right? If you're going to read out something from a scientific paper, what I would suggest is read the scientific paper. Don't just rely on the fact that, I don't know, somebody like Essence of Thought probably read the paragraph out and just assume that they'd read it for you. Okay, this was not a review of the data. This paper was a systematic review, but it wasn't a review of the physiology of sport and trans women and whether cross-sex hormone therapy mitigates their performance, as it calls it in the title. Sport and transgender people, a systematic review of the literature relating to sport participation and competitive sport policies. Well, the sport policies are irrelevant. Method, 8 research articles and 31 sports policies. Well, like I say, the sports policies aren't going to tell us whether or not. They're just kind of setting the sort of rules and regulations of who could do what. So what about these 8 studies? Right, let me read you some of these 8 studies. To explore 2 transgender male individuals' experiences of sport in an educational and recreational environment. To explore the experience of a transgender female participating in women's national ice hockey tournaments. To explore transgender people's experiences of sport in relation to social exclusion and minority stress theory. To examine the renegotiation of sex-based boundaries within the context of transgender inclusion in North American lesbian softball leagues. Just to read you a bit more about that last one, positive experiences were more often reported by transgender women than transgender men in relation to inclusion despite the renegotiation of sex boundaries. Look, I'm sure this is all fascinating stuff, right? And in terms of sports participation, which is what these studies were about, then it's absolutely mint. Like I say, if you'd bothered to actually read this report, then you'd probably have not wondered quite so much why women are not dominating, trans women are not dominating female sport. But the fact remains that of those 8 actual research articles, there is only one of them, Goran and Bunk, that is at all relevant to physiology and whether cross-sex hormone therapy has the necessary effects on reducing trans women's performance by the necessary amount. What happened is the people who wrote that report, I don't know how this gets past peer review, but they just decided on the basis of that and on the basis of writing a paper which wasn't about the physiology of trans women's performance or investigating that, to just say, well, there's nothing out there which shows anything, and that managed to pass muster. But this was not a systematic review of that. They did not review the data. All they reviewed was Goran and Bunk. And this isn't even up to date on that. You must have seen, if you're interested in this, the Karolinska study which is being talked about. Now, there may be some issues with this study, but you can't ignore it. This is what the Karolinska study had to say. Okay, I won't read this quite in order because I want to remove the bits for trans men, because they looked at trans men as well as trans women. In trans women, thigh muscle volume decreased by 5% and 4%, while density remained unaltered. Trans women generally maintained or slightly increased in strength. Now, if you read the whole report, always something that's worth doing, just a thought. What they point out is that these are untrained athletes, so don't read too much into it, but also these are untrained athletes, and so probably what happened as they came back on the 4 different occasions to try these tests again, that probably because they had familiarity with the test, they were applying more force. You know what it's like as a sports person, Brenton. If you do something that you've done before, then you can put a little bit more oomph into it. You're used to the motion. You know what you've got to do. You let yourself go a little bit more. So maybe that is it. It seems unlikely that they actually gained in strength, and I find it hard to believe that they didn't lose some strength, but certainly no indication that they lost the 30 to 40% strength that they would need to lose to have bridged the gap between their performance as somebody who has gone through male pubertal development and where they would have been had they been exactly the same person but not gone through that male pubertal development, which is the gap we need to bridge. Okay, so sick of hearing of this particular paper being quoted as if it's about the physiology of trans women when it isn't. It's about sports participation and competitive sports policies, making a statement that they had no right to make because that was not what their report was about. It was just their personal opinion, effectively. Okay, that's it. That's the end of this. I hope that you've enjoyed this video. I've segmented it into these 8 different arguments so that you can pick and choose the bits that you want to look at. I hope that you've all got something out of this. Thank you to my patrons. Stuff like this takes quite a lot of work to do, and it's their support that allows me to do these slightly more involved projects. Hope you've enjoyed the video. Thank you for watching, and bye.